He couldn't have ever expected her to become the best part of his week. Every Friday at 4:00 p.m., Ethan Reed straightened the stacks by the window, brewed fresh coffee, and pretended not to look up when she walked through the door. She never stayed long an hour, maybe two, just enough time to thumb through the new arrivals or sit quietly with a paperback in hand. She always smiled, always said goodbye, and always left before sunset. He never asked her name. Maybe he was afraid to ruin the ritual. Maybe, after everything he'd lost, it was enough to simply feel the pull of something warm again. But the Friday she didn't come, the silence hit harder than he expected. And when the next Friday came and she still wasn't there, he told himself she'd be back the next week. Then, on the third Friday, he found the letter tucked inside her favorite book. No return address. Just his name in delicate handwriting, and the first line that would change everything. I didn't know how to say goodbye. Some stories begin with a hello. Others wait for the courage to leave a letter behind. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as Ethan Reed flipped the sign from closed to open, the sound echoing faintly through the quiet shop. Morning light spilled through the front windows, streaking across the rows of well-worn shelves and casting warm stripes over the hardwood floor. The scent of old paper and coffee mingled in the air, comforting and familiar, like a favorite song you didn't realize you missed until it played again. He moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the rhythm of the morning. It was always like this at the start of the day, peaceful, predictable. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee behind the counter, arranged the returns from yesterday in the front display, and glanced at the small table near the back where children's books sat in a cheerful heap. His daughter, Maisie, had already pulled her favorites to the top of the pile. He could hear her humming from the reading nook, lost in a world of princesses and dragons. Ethan smiled to himself and took a sip from his chipped mug. He had learned to cherish these simple moments. Life didn't leave much room for glamour or spontaneity anymore. Not since Amanda had left. Not since he'd become both mom and dad, business owner and bedtime storyteller. There had been a time when he thought he needed more success, more adventure. Now, he only needed Maisie to smile and the rent to be paid. It hadn't always been books. He used to manage logistics for a shipping company, working long hours under fluorescent lights, staring at spreadsheets and cargo reports. When Amanda got sick, he quit without a plan. She'd always loved the idea of a bookstore, used to talk about opening one when they retired. After she passed, it felt like a promise he hadn't known he'd made. So he opened the shop and named it after her favorite novel. Reed's pages sat quietly on a sleepy corner, not far from the school, and just obscure enough to be charming. The regulars came and went. Tourists stumbled in during summer. Locals brought coffee and conversation in winter. Ethan learned names, preferences, and favorite authors. But he kept his life measured, quiet. He had no interest in surprises. At least, not until the woman started coming in on Fridays. He didn't know her name. She'd first arrived nearly a year ago, on a cold afternoon in November, wrapped in a long navy coat and carrying a leather-bound notebook. She hadn't said much that first time. Just wandered the aisles, chose a novel, and disappeared with a polite smile. The next Friday, she returned, and the Friday after that. Over time, it became a pattern as reliable as the ticking clock above the register. 4 o'clock, her arrival, a book or two, a quiet goodbye. She was never loud, never flirtatious. There was something steady about her presence, something that nudged its way into his routine like a song you start humming without realizing. Maisie liked her. She'd shyly offered a drawing once, which the woman had accepted with a kind smile and a soft thank you that had made Ethan's throat tighten for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He never asked her name. He never needed to. There was a comfort in the unknown, in the quiet space she filled just by showing up. Friday was tomorrow, and he already knew he'd straighten the shelves by the window, brew fresh coffee, and try not to look up too eagerly when the bell chimed again. She arrived just as the light began to slant gold through the front windows, the same as she always did. 4 o'clock, give or take a minute. The bell above the door gave its usual polite ring, and Ethan glanced up from the counter, already knowing it would be her. She wore a green scarf today, wrapped loosely around her neck, the ends trailing over her coat. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands escaping near her temples. She had that familiar look about her, as if the world outside never quite touched her the same way it touched everyone else. She paused inside the doorway like she always did, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light of the shop. Then she smiled, soft and quick, and walked toward the shelves near the window. Ethan gave a small nod in return. Nothing more. That was their unspoken rhythm. A look, a smile, a pause that always felt like it could become something more but never quite did. Maisie was curled in her usual spot on the beanbag in the corner, a picture book open on her lap. She peeked up and waved. "Hi," she chirped. The woman's smile widened just a little. "Hi, Maisie." Ethan wasn't sure when she had learned his daughter's name. Maybe the third or fourth visit, when Maisie had boldly offered her a sticker and declared that she looked like a princess. Since then, their brief exchanges had become part of the weekly ritual too. She never lingered long with the child, never overstepped, but she always acknowledged her, always with kindness. She wandered through the store with quiet familiarity, touching the spines of books as if greeting old friends. Sometimes she picked up poetry, sometimes historical fiction. Once, she'd left with a battered copy of Wuthering Heights and told him softly, "I always come back to this one." He hadn't asked what she meant. Today, she lingered near the non-fiction shelf. She pulled a book halfway out, glanced at the cover, and slid it back in. She moved without hurry, like someone who had made peace with silence a long time ago. There was something in the way she carried herself that made Ethan want to know her story and at the same time fear what it might be. After about 20 minutes, she settled into the chair near the front window. She always sat there when it was empty. The chair was old and worn, its fabric a faded burgundy, but she seemed to prefer it. She read with one leg tucked beneath her, her fingers brushing the edge of the pages as she turned them. Ethan wiped down the counter for the second time in 10 minutes and reminded himself not to stare. He didn't understand why her presence unsettled him. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense. It was gentler, more careful, as if something inside him recognized something inside her, and both were too wounded to speak. As closing time approached, she rose quietly and returned the book to its place. She walked toward the register, gave him a small smile, and placed a paperback on the counter. "This one," she said. He took the book, scanned the worn barcode, and tried to ignore the way her voice settled in his chest like warm water. "Good choice," he said, holding it out to her. She tucked it into her bag, met his eyes briefly, then looked away. "See you next Friday." She didn't say it like a question. It was a statement of fact, a part of their agreement, however silent it remained. Ethan gave a short nod, then watched as she walked out into the dusk, the green scarf catching in the breeze. He didn't know her name. But every Friday she came back, and every Friday he hoped a little more that one day she'd stay just a little longer. Fridays became a quiet kind of promise. Rain or shine, the shop opened at 10, and the rhythm of the day played out like a song Ethan had memorized by heart. A few regulars would come by in the morning, a teacher picking up a new release, or an elderly man who only ever asked for war biographies. Maisie would spend the afternoon drawing pictures behind the counter or reading out loud to her dolls, and by 4 o'clock, the bell above the door would chime, and she would appear. Her name, he learned, was Clara. She said it casually one afternoon, in response to a joke Maisie made. The girl had drawn a picture of the three of them, two tall stick figures and one small one with a rainbow dress, and labeled them Dad, Me, and Book Lady. Clara had laughed, then crouched beside Maisie and said, "I guess I'm Clara now, not just the Book Lady." The name settled around Ethan like a new coat. Strange at first, but comforting. Clara. He whispered it to himself later that night when the store was dark and still, as if saying it aloud might make her more real somehow. Their conversations deepened. Slowly, carefully, Clara had a quiet way of revealing herself, like peeling back the pages of a novel one chapter at a time. She taught piano lessons in the evenings, mostly to children, and had moved to town just over a year ago. She rented a small apartment above a florist's shop and liked to walk everywhere. Her parents lived out west, and she hadn't seen them in a while. When she spoke about her life, it was always in pieces, never quite forming a full picture, but Ethan never pushed. He understood how carefully people carried certain parts of themselves, and how easily something fragile could be lost if examined too closely. She never talked about relationships. He didn't either. It was a quiet agreement. one he never thought to break. Once, when the shop was empty except for the three of them, Clara asked if she could read to Maisie, while Ethan restocked the front display. He nodded, heart catching in his throat. He listened from the next aisle, as Clara's voice filled the air, gentle and animated. Maisie giggled and corrected her when she changed a word, and Clara apologized with a dramatic gasp that made the child howl with laughter. Ethan peeked around the shelf, watching them. Maisie leaned into Clara's side like she belonged there. Clara glanced up and caught his eye. She didn't smile. She just held his gaze, calm and sure, and he felt something shift in his chest, something old and still beginning to wake. Later that week, Ethan found himself straightening his collar before she arrived. It wasn't something he did consciously at first, just a flick of his hand over his shirt, a glance in the window's reflection. But it happened again the next week, and the next. One Friday, Clara brought pastries from the corner bakery and set them on the counter without ceremony. "I bought too many," she said, though Ethan could see the way she'd chosen the exact one Maisie liked best. Another time, when he mentioned needing to replace a broken reading lamp, she returned the following week with one she said she didn't use anymore. It fit the shop perfectly, casting soft golden light over the display near the register. He thanked her, and she shrugged, but her eyes lingered on his a little longer that day. The air between them changed slowly, like the shift from winter to spring. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, just small moments strung together like pearls on a thread. A shared laugh, a quiet touch when their hands met over a book, the way she paused in the doorway a little longer each time before leaving. One Friday near the end of summer, Clara stayed past closing. The store was quiet, Maisie already home with a babysitter, and the evening stretched soft and golden around them. Clara leaned against the counter, thumbing through a poetry collection she hadn't yet decided to buy. Ethan wiped down the espresso machine, more to keep his hands busy than anything else. "You ever think," Clara said, eyes on the page, "how certain places make you feel like yourself again?" He looked up. "Yeah, sometimes." She closed the book and set it down. "This place does that for me." He didn't know what to say. His heart beat harder in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might say something brave, something real. But she reached for her bag and smiled, and the moment passed. "See you next Friday," she said. He nodded. "See you then." And as she disappeared into the evening light, Ethan stood behind the counter, hands still damp from the cloth, wondering how something so quiet could begin to feel so necessary. The next Friday, Clara arrived late. Not by much, just 10 or 15 minutes, but Ethan noticed. He always noticed. The bell rang as it always did, and she stepped inside with her shoulders hunched slightly, her coat not buttoned properly, her hair pulled back in a rush. She offered a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Ethan straightened from where he was shelving returns. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice easy. "Hi," she answered, softer than usual. Maisie was coloring near the counter and waved, but Clara only gave a small wave in return before moving quickly to the back of the store. She didn't browse the shelves or pause to read a book cover. She walked to her favorite chair near the window, sat down, and stared outside. Ethan didn't know what to do with the shift in her. He wiped his hands on a towel, debated whether to give her space or approach, and finally poured 2 cups of coffee. He brought one over, setting it gently on the small table beside her. She looked up. "Thanks," she murmured. He sat in the chair across from her. "You okay?" Clara nodded, but the movement was mechanical. Just a long day. The silence between them stretched, heavier than usual. Outside, the light was beginning to fade. Inside, the quiet felt too loud. Clara kept her eyes on the street, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. "You ever have a day," she said after a while, "where everything feels too close and too far away all at once?" Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, more than I'd like." She glanced at him, as if testing whether she could trust his answer. Then she looked away again. "I used to be really good at disappearing," she said. "I could pack a bag and leave town in less than an hour. Start fresh. No one noticed." Her voice didn't carry bitterness, only weariness. "Sounds lonely," he said. Clara gave a small, almost laugh. "It was. It is. Sometimes." He wanted to ask more, but the lines in her face told him she was already at her limit. She finished her coffee and stood. He followed her to the register, but she didn't buy anything. Instead, she slid a paperback back onto the shelf by the counter, hesitating just slightly as her fingers touched the spine. "I should go," she said. Maisie looked up from her coloring, her brow creasing. "You're leaving already?" Clara knelt beside her. "I'll see you next Friday, okay?" Maisie nodded, though her smile faltered. Clara stood and met Ethan's eyes, something unsaid hanging between them. She looked like she might say more, but then she just gave a quiet goodbye and stepped out into the night. After they closed, Ethan began tidying the front table. When he reached the book Clara had touched, he picked it up and found a slip of paper tucked inside. Not a receipt or a bookmark, but a page torn from a journal. On it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Sometimes you leave, so you don't get left." He stared at the paper for a long time before folding it gently and sliding it into the drawer behind the register. The following Friday, Ethan stood behind the counter, pretending not to check the clock every few minutes. 4 o'clock came, then 5. He waited until 6 before admitting it to himself. Clara wasn't coming. He closed the store at 7, later than usual, lingering by the door as if she might still appear. The sidewalk was empty, the street quiet. Just the distant sound of a bus pulling away and a few scattered leaves skipping across the pavement. He flipped the sign to closed and locked up without saying it out loud, but the silence in the shop felt different. Not peaceful, not still, just hollow. Maisie noticed too. She asked where Clara was as they ate leftover pasta at the kitchen table, her voice casual, but her eyes watching him closely. He said maybe Clara had other plans, maybe she was just busy. It wasn't a lie, not really, but it didn't feel like the truth either. The next Friday, Ethan didn't say anything to Maisie when he dropped her off with the sitter. He didn't make coffee at 4. He didn't straighten the display by the window. He did everything slowly, cautiously, like walking through fog. And when 4 o'clock passed with only the sound of a delivery truck out front, he kept his back to the door and tried not to look up. At 5, a customer came in for a used copy of Steinbeck. At 6, he cleaned the espresso machine again. At 7, he stood at the window for a long time, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the familiar route she used to walk. She didn't come. It was easier somehow to expect she'd be back the next week. Easier to pretend it was a fluke, a cold, a piano recital that ran late. People miss things all the time. But the third Friday arrived, and this time the waiting felt like a wound. The hours dragged, and the bookstore echoed with every movement. Ethan couldn't concentrate. He shelved the same 3 books twice, answered a customer's question with the wrong title, and forgot to start the afternoon pot of coffee. When he locked up, the weight in his chest was no longer something he could ignore. He went through the usual motions, shutting off the lights, turning the sign. Then he walked to the reading nook, where Clara always sat, unsure why. And there, resting on the arm of the burgundy chair, was an envelope. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. His name was written in ink across the front in familiar handwriting. No postage, no return address, just Ethan. He took it behind the counter, set it down gently, and turned off the last of the lights. The store was dark and still, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. He didn't open the letter right away. He just sat beside it, palms resting on the counter, heart pounding like a question he wasn't ready to ask. Ethan waited until the house was quiet, until Maisie was asleep and the street outside had emptied of the last footsteps and engines. He sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of him, still sealed. The edges were soft, as if she had held it for a while before leaving it behind. The name on the front looked calm, certain. He wasn't. He broke the seal carefully, unfolded the pages, and let his eyes settle on the first line. "I didn't know how to say goodbye." The words blurred for a moment before he blinked and kept reading. "I told myself I was just passing through, that I'd stay in town for a few weeks, teach some lessons, find something quiet and temporary. But then I found the bookstore, and I found you, and Maisie. And that quiet, temporary plan started to feel like something I didn't deserve. There are things I haven't told you, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't know if you'd look at me the same way if I did. I left behind more than just a city. I left behind a life I couldn't fix, a version of myself I didn't want to be anymore. The people I used to know wouldn't call me dangerous, but they wouldn't call me whole either. I've done a lot of starting over, and I got good at it. But being around you made me want to stop. For the first time in a long time, I looked forward to something. To someone. You made quiet feel like comfort instead of punishment. You made stillness feel safe. But when you looked at me, I couldn't stop wondering if you were seeing who I was or who I wanted to be. And when I watched you with Maisie, it made me ache. Because I realized how much I wanted that. And how afraid I was to want anything again. I wish I could explain this in person. I wish I was brave enough to stay. But I've learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away before someone asks you to. You should know that it was never just a bookstore to me. It was the first place in years that felt like home. And you, Ethan, were the reason. Tell Maisie I'll never forget her stories, or her stickers, or the way she made me feel like I was worth knowing again. Thank you for Friday afternoons. They saved me more than I ever let on. There was no signature, no forwarding address, just a blank space where a name should have been, as if even now she was choosing to leave some part of herself behind. Ethan stared at the letter long after he finished reading. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just sat there, the pages resting in his lap, the silence pressing in close, and the sound of her voice lingering in the space she used to fill. The leaves turned slowly that year. The reds came later than usual, and the golds hung on longer than they should have. Ethan noticed the shift more than he used to. Maybe because she was gone. Maybe because the world felt sharper now, quieter, but not in the same peaceful way it once had. He didn't talk about the letter, not even to Maisie. He folded it carefully, placed it in a small wooden box under the register, and left it there. Sometimes he would take it out at the end of the day, not to read it, just to hold it, just to remember the weight of something that had felt like it could have been more. Fridays came and went. He stopped waiting at the window. He made coffee only once in the morning, not again in the afternoon. The chair near the front stayed empty for weeks, and then a stranger took it one rainy day, flipping through a mystery novel without realizing who had once sat there every week. Maisie asked once, about a month later. She didn't say her name, just asked if the book lady was coming back. Ethan hesitated before saying he didn't know. It was the truth. He wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Business stayed steady. The routine returned. Ethan found a new rhythm, one that didn't include watching the door at 4 o'clock. He took Maisie to the park more. They visited the lake on Sundays. She was growing fast. Her questions got sharper, her drawings more detailed. She still drew pictures of the three of them sometimes, though now she labeled the third figure Clara. One evening, he sat with a book in his lap and realized he'd read the same page 3 times. The story wasn't sinking in. His thoughts drifted back to the way Clara used to run her fingers over the spines of books. The way her voice lowered when she read aloud. The way she'd linger at the door like she was caught between leaving and staying. Ethan didn't feel angry. Not anymore. Just unfinished. He caught himself once, writing her name on a sticky note when reorganizing the customer list. There was no reason for it. No order to fulfill. No card on file. He peeled it off and folded it in half, adding it to the box under the counter without saying a word. Autumn gave way to early winter. The air turned crisp, the days shorter. The bookstore leaned into the season. He strung soft lights across the front windows, put out hot cider for guests. It helped. The warmth, the effort, the knowledge that life didn't pause just because someone walked away. Then, one Wednesday afternoon, as he was helping a teenager find a school reading assignment, Maisie called from across the shop. "Daddy," she said, holding up a paperback. "There's something in here." Ethan crossed the store, expecting a forgotten receipt or an old bookmark. But when he opened the book, a folded scrap of paper fell into his hand. It was her handwriting. Only one sentence. Friday came with rain. Not a storm, not loud, just the steady kind that softened the edges of the town. The kind that made people linger inside longer than usual, duck under awnings, shuffle through bookstores instead of rushing home. Ethan opened the shop the same as always, turned the sign, swept the entryway. Maisie helped stack a few new arrivals on the front table, her eyes flicking to the door now and then, though she said nothing about the note. She had slipped it into his hand, like it was a secret, only the two of them should share. He hadn't said much after reading it. He didn't know what to say. He still wasn't sure if it had been left for him, or just by chance, like a page torn loose from a story that had never really ended. He kept busy that day, restocking the shelves, rearranging displays. Customers came and went. Some browsed quietly. A few asked for recommendations. Maisie curled up near the register with a blanket and a chapter book, her legs swinging over the side of the chair. By the time the clock reached 4, Ethan wasn't sure what he believed. The rain tapped lightly at the windows. The bell above the door was still. He didn't expect it. He told himself he wasn't waiting. But when the bell finally rang, and she stepped inside, everything in him stilled. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her coat damp, her scarf pulled loose at her throat. She looked different, but not in any obvious way. Maybe it was the way her shoulders settled a little lower, the way she met his eyes without looking away. She looked tired, but clear. Ethan took a step forward. He didn't speak at first. Neither did she. Then Clara gave a small smile. "I wasn't sure if I should come." He nodded. "You're here." She stepped closer. The air between them filled slowly, not rushed, not uncertain. Her hand was damp where it brushed his. She didn't pull away. "I didn't think I'd miss this place as much as I did," she said. "Turns out, I missed everything about it." He searched her face, looking for something he couldn't name. "Why now?" Clara glanced at Maisie, who was watching them from behind her book, trying not to smile. Then she looked back at him. "Because leaving didn't make it easier, and staying away didn't stop me from hoping you'd still be here." Ethan breathed out slowly. "I was." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt full, like something finished settling into place. Clara looked around the shop, eyes trailing over the shelves, the reading chair, the soft light overhead. She took a breath and let it out like she'd been holding it for months. "Can I stay a while?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you can stay." She smiled again, warmer this time, and took his hand without hesitation. They stood like that for a moment, not saying anything more. The rain outside kept falling, and inside, the bookstore felt full again.